Welcome to DCF Investigations. There are crimes that horrify us because of their brutality. And then there are crimes that haunt us because of their sheer inexplicability. There are murders that seem to defy the logic of human behavior, crossing a threshold into something ancient, primal, and terrifying. We are accustomed to motives like greed, jealousy, rage, or revenge. We can understand, however darkly, the drive to silence a witness or eliminate a rival. But what happens when the motive appears to be hunger? Not a hunger for food, nor a hunger for money, but a hunger for the very essence of life itself. Today, we are traveling back in time to the cobblestone streets of Stockholm, Sweden. We are going to the year 1932, to a district known as Atlas. It is here, in a small, unassuming apartment, that police would uncover a scene so grotesque, so bizarre, that it would spawn a legend that has persisted for nearly a century. This is not just a story about a murder. It is a story about the darkness that resides in the human psyche. A darkness that earned one unknown killer the name that still sends shivers down the spines of Swedish detectives. This is the story of the Atlas vampire. To truly understand the gravity of this case, we must first immerse ourselves in the atmosphere of Stockholm in the early 1930s. The world was in the grip of the Great Depression. Sweden, while somewhat insulated compared to the devastation in the United States or Germany, was not immune. It was a time of uncertainty. The social fabric was stretching. In the district of Vasastan, there was a specific area known as Atlas. Today, and this area is often referred to as Little Paris, a charming and picturesque neighborhood. But in 1932, the Atlas area had a different reputation. It was nestled in the shadow of the heavy industrial machinery of the Atlas factories. It was a place of stark contrasts, where the working class mingled with those living on the fringes of society. The architecture itself contributed to the mood. The buildings were heavy, stone structures, looming over narrow streets. In the winter and early spring, the Nordic darkness would settle over the city early in the afternoon, casting long, deep shadows that seemed to swallow the gaslight. It was a place where people kept their secrets close, where neighbors lived wall to wall, but often knew very little about what happened behind closed doors. Living in this neighborhood, at Sankt Eriksplan 11, I was a 32-year-old woman named Lilly Lindeström. To understand the tragedy of her death, we must first look at her life. Lilly was born in Malmö in 1900, but she had moved to the capital to find her way in the world. By 1932, she was a divorced woman, which carried a certain social stigma at the time. She was described by those who knew her as attractive, well-liked, and quiet. She was not a troublemaker. She was not known to be involved in dangerous gangs or illicit smuggling rings. However, Lilly lived a precarious existence. To make ends meet in the harsh economic climate of the 1930s, she worked as a prostitute. In the parlance of the time, she was often referred to as a call girl, implying a certain level of discretion and a higher class of clientele than the women who walked the streets. She operated out of her small apartment on the ground floor. It was a modest space, a single room with a kitchenette, but it was her sanctuary. It was where she lived, and it was where she worked. This dual nature of her apartment is crucial to the investigation. It meant that strange men coming and going from her residence was not an unusual occurrence. It meant that the neighbors, while perhaps observant, were accustomed to turning a blind eye to the visitors who arrived in the evening and left in the dead of night. This veil of privacy, necessary for her profession, would ultimately become the very thing that allowed a monster to slip in and out undetected. The timeline of the horror begins in late April and early May of 1932. It was the time of Walpurgis Night, a traditional holiday in Sweden, celebrating the arrival of spring with bonfires and singing. The city was coming out of the long, dark winter. On April 30th, Lilly was seen by her neighbors. She appeared normal. There was no indication of distress, no sign that she was being stalked or threatened. She was simply living her life, navigating the complexities of her profession and her solitude. The last confirmed sighting of Lilly Lindeström alive was on the evening of May 4th, 1932. She was in her apartment. We know this because she had a brief interaction with her neighbor and friend, Minnie Johnson. Minnie lived in the same building, on the same floor. She was perhaps the closest thing Lilly had to a confidant in the building. According to Minnie's later testimony to the police, Lilly had knocked on her door in the early evening. Now, Lilly was not wearing a coat or outdoor clothing. She was dressed for being indoors, perhaps in a robe or light dress. She asked Minnie for a favor. She needed a condom. In 1932, contraception was not something openly displayed on store counters. And for women in Lilly's line of work, these items were essential tools of the trade. Minnie provided her with one. This brief, mundane exchange is the pivot point upon which the entire case turns. It confirms two things. First, Lilly was alive and well at that moment. Second, she was expecting a client. She was preparing for a visitor. Minnie Jansen would later recall that Lilly seemed entirely normal. She wasn't fearful. She wasn't anxious. She didn't whisper about a dangerous customer or a man she was afraid of. She simply needed the item and returned to her apartment. The door clicked shut. That was the last time anyone saw Lilly Lindeström alive. The days that followed were marked by a growing silence. On May 5th, Minnie didn't see Lilly. This wasn't immediately alarming. Perhaps she'd gone out, or perhaps she was sleeping late. But as May 6th arrived and passed, the silence from the apartment at St. Eriksplan 11 began to feel heavy. Minnie Johnson knocked on Lilly's door. There was no answer. She listened at the wood. There was no sound of movement inside. No footsteps, no running water, no radio. Just a dead, heavy silence. By May 7th, the concern had turned into dread. It had been 3 days since the brief interaction about the condom. Lilly was not the type to disappear without a word. Minnie, trusting her instincts, decided that something was wrong. She contacted the police. So when the Stockholm police arrived at the building, the atmosphere was tense. We must remember that policing in 1932 was very different from today. There were no digital databases, no DNA profiling, no CCTV cameras. It was a world of fingerprints, blood types, and shoe leather. The officers approached the door of the apartment. They knocked, announcing their presence. Silence. They tried the handle. It was locked. This detail is important. The door was locked from the outside or the inside. The reports indicate the apartment was secured, suggesting the killer had locked the door upon leaving, or Lilly had locked it herself before the attack. The police forced entry. As the door swung open, the officers were not met with a chaotic scene of struggle. Furniture was not overturned. Lamps were not smashed. The apartment was, at first glance, tidy. But as they moved further into the room, the smell hit them. It was the unmistakable, cloying scent of death, mingled with something else. They found Lilly. She was lying on her bed. Her position was face down. She was naked. Her clothes had been removed, but they weren't scattered around the room in a frenzy. They were folded, neatly, methodically. They were placed on a chair beside the bed. This detail alone sent a chill through the investigators. It spoke of a killer who was calm, a killer who took their time. This was not a crime of sudden, blinding passion where clothes are ripped and torn. This was a ritual. But the true horror was not just that Lilly was dead. It was the condition of her body. She had been bludgeoned to death. The cause of death was severe trauma to the head, likely from a heavy object, and the blows had been fatal and crushing. However, what confused the medical examiners and the detectives on the scene was the blood, or rather, the lack of it. In a brutal bludgeoning, one expects a scene of immense gore. Arterial spray, pools of blood soaking the mattress and the floor. While there was blood present, the volume was suspiciously low for the type of wounds Lilly had sustained. Her body appeared pale, eerily white, as if drained. The autopsy would later confirm this terrifying suspicion. Lilly Lindeström's body was almost completely drained of blood. It was estimated that nearly all of her blood volume was missing. But where was it? It wasn't on the bed. It wasn't on the floor. It hadn't soaked through the floorboards to the ceiling below. The blood was simply gone. The investigators began to comb the tiny apartment for clues, for the weapon, for anything that could explain this anomaly. They found the condom that Minnie Johnson had given Lilly. It was used, and it was found in a degrading position, protruding from the victim's body. This suggested a sexual component to the crime, a final act of humiliation or a specific fetishistic ritual by the killer. But then, they found the object that would give this case its name. In the kitchenette, among the mundane clutter of daily life, they found a gravy ladle. It was a standard household item, a silver-plated scoop used for serving soup or sauce. But this ladle was not clean. It was stained. Forensic analysis of the time confirmed that the ladle was coated in blood. The detectives were forced to confront a hypothesis that seemed to belong in a Gothic novel rather than a police report. The killer had struck Lilly down, crushing her skull. Then, with the victim lying on the bed, the killer had likely slit her throat or used the wounds to access her blood. And then, using the ladle from her own kitchen, the killer had scooped up her blood. And they had consumed it. There was no bucket found full of blood. There were no containers filled with red liquid to be taken away as a trophy. The blood was missing, and the ladle was the only tool. The inference was inescapable, because the killer had eaten, or rather drunk, at the scene of the crime. This revelation hit the Stockholm press like a thunderbolt. The newspapers, desperate for sensational stories during the grim Depression years, seized upon the detail of the ladle and the drained body. They dubbed the unknown assailant Vampiric, or the Vampire. Later, because of the location, the name evolved into the Atlas Vampire. The police were under immense pressure. The public was terrified. A monster was loose in Stockholm, a creature that didn't just kill women, but consume them. The investigation was launched with the full force of the Stockholm Constabulary. They began by looking at the people closest to Lilly. They interviewed Minnie Johnson extensively. They tried to trace the client Lilly was expecting. Who was he? How did he contact her? In 1932, appointments for call girls were often made via word of mouth or through telephone calls to a shared building phone. There were no digital footprints to trace. The police questioned Lilly's ex-husband. He was interrogated, his alibi checked and rechecked. But nothing stuck. He had moved on. There was no evidence linking him to the scene, and certainly nothing in his psychological profile suggested the kind of aberrant behavior found at the crime scene. They looked at her regular clients. Being a sex worker, Lilly had a roster of men who visited her. But a woman in her position kept no ledger, no diary of names, for obvious reasons. Anonymity was part of the service. The police were chasing ghosts. They brought in men from the neighborhood, men with records of violence, men known to frequent sex workers. Hundreds were questioned. None could be definitively linked to the apartment on that specific night. The forensic evidence, while shocking, was limited by the era. They had the ladle. They had the condom. They had fingerprints from the room. But without a suspect to match the prints to, they were useless. The saliva on the condom or the ladle could not be analyzed for DNA. The blood type could be determined. But in 1932, millions of people shared the same blood type. It was a class characteristic, not an individual identifier. The investigators were also looking for a specific psychological profile. They consulted with psychiatrists of the time. What kind of person does this? The term serial killer did not exist yet. They were dealing with what they termed a lust murderer or a sexual sadist. In modern criminology, we might look at this through the lens of clinical vampirism, sometimes known as Renfield syndrome, named after the character in Bram Stoker's Dracula. This is a rare psychiatric disorder where the sufferer feels a compulsion to consume blood. It is often linked to a sexual fetish where blood ingestion provides sexual gratification. The presence of the used condom and the drained body strongly points to a paraphilia, a sexual deviation, where the act of killing and the act of consuming blood were intrinsically linked. The neat folding of the clothes is another massive clue that modern profilers would seize upon. It suggests an organized offender. This wasn't a chaotic, psychotic break where the killer didn't know where they were. This person was controlled. They took the time to undress the victim, or force her to undress, and place the clothes neatly. They felt comfortable in the apartment. They didn't rush. They stayed long enough to drain the body, a process that would take time. They stayed long enough to use the ladle. This comfort level suggests the killer might have been a regular client, someone Lilly knew and trusted enough to let in, someone who had been there before. One specific suspect emerged in the whispers of the investigation, though he was never named publicly as the definitive killer. There were reports of a strange man seen in the Atlas area, a man who seemed to take an unhealthy interest in the women of the district. But descriptions were vague. A man in a coat. A man with a hat. In 1930s, Stockholm, that described half the male population. As the weeks turned into months, the leads began to dry up. The Great Depression ground on. Other crimes occurred. The newspapers eventually moved on to the next scandal. But the police file remained open. The ladle, the grim totem of the crime, they sat in the evidence locker. 9 suspects were eventually shortlisted, men who had the opportunity or the propensity for violence. But there was never enough evidence to arrest any of them. The DNA that could have solved the case, the saliva on the condom, the skin cells on the ladle handle, degraded or was destroyed by the primitive handling techniques of the 1930s. The case of the Atlas vampire remains one of Sweden's most infamous cold cases. It sits in the archives of the Swedish Police Museum, a testament to a horror that was never brought to justice. But we must dig deeper. We must look at the theories that have arisen over the decades. One theory suggests the killer was a butcher or someone with anatomical knowledge. The draining of the blood was thorough. But to drain a human body so completely requires knowledge of the major arteries. It requires a certain callousness, a familiarity with the mechanics of flesh and fluid. The Atlas district was near industrial areas. Was the killer a worker from the slaughterhouses? Another theory posits that the killer was a doctor or medical student. This is a common trope in unsolved mutilation murders, dating back to Jack the Ripper. The precision, the calm, the ability to handle a dead body without panic. Was it a wealthy doctor from the upper-class districts who came to the working-class Atlas neighborhood to indulge in his darkest fantasies? Knowing that the death of a sex worker would not be investigated with the same fervor as the death of a debutante. However, there is also the theory of the client gone wrong. Perhaps it was not a premeditated vampire attack. Perhaps it was a regular transaction that turned violent. A dispute over money? A refusal to perform a specific act? The rage exploded. Lilly was killed. And then, in the aftermath, the killer's psychosis took over, leading to the consumption of blood. The ladle was simply a tool of opportunity, grabbed from the kitchenette in a moment of madness. And then, there are the more conspiratorial whispers. Some have suggested a police cover-up. Why was the apartment so clean? Why were there no footprints? Did the killer have a badge? Did he know how to clean a crime scene because he was one of the men investigating it? While there is zero historical evidence to support this, it remains a favorite theory of amateur sleuths who look at the impossibility of the clean escape. Let us return to the scene one last time. Imagine the silence of that room. The folded clothes on the chair, the ladle resting on the counter, the body on the bed. It is a tableau of frozen horror. The killer walked out of that apartment into the cool May night of Stockholm and simply vanished. He likely walked past neighbors. He might have taken the tram. He might have gone home to a family, to a wife, to children, carrying the metallic taste of blood in his mouth. He lived among the people of Stockholm. He may have lived for decades more. Did he kill again? Most criminologists agree that a lust murderer with such a specific, developed ritual, the blood drinking, does not simply stop. It is an escalating addiction. Were there other victims, dismissed as accidents or unsolved assaults, that were actually the work of the Atlas vampire? Or did he die shortly after? Did he commit suicide, overwhelmed by the monster inside him? Or was he arrested for another crime, perhaps a theft or a minor assault, and spent his days in prison, his secret locked away in his mind? The tragedy of Lilly Lindeström is that she has become defined by her death. She has become a character in a horror story, the victim of the vampire. We must remember that she was a woman trying to survive in a hard world. She had friends who cared about her, like Minnie Janssen. She had a life, a history, and dreams. Her life was stolen by a predator who treated her not as a human being, but as a vessel. Today, the Atlas area is gentrified. The dark, industrial shadows are gone, replaced by cafes and expensive apartments. But if you walk past St. Eriksplan 11 on a quiet night, it is hard not to think of what happened there in May of 1932. The building still stands. The walls are the same. The history is embedded in the stone. Forensic science has advanced light years since then. If the crime happened today, the saliva on the condom would pinpoint the killer in a national database. The blood spatter, even if cleaned, would be revealed by luminol. CCTV would catch the man entering and leaving. But in 1932, the shadows were deeper, the silence was thicker, and the Atlas vampire was allowed to slip away into the fog of history. As we conclude this deep dive into the macabre, we are left with the unsettling realization that some monsters are real. They don't have fangs, and they don't turn into bats, and they look like us. They walk among us, and sometimes they get away with it. This has been a production of DCF Investigations. We have walked the streets of 1932 Stockholm and stared into the abyss of an unsolved nightmare. Now, I turn the question to you. Do you believe the Atlas vampire was a one-time offender who snapped? Or was this the work of a serial predator who simply wasn't caught? And does the neat folding of the clothes suggest a killer who felt remorse, or a killer who felt total ownership over his victim? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. Until next time, stay observant and stay safe.